this video, we're going to do our third lecture on factor markets. And in this, we're going to learn about imperfectly competitive factor markets. Imperfectly competitive. And what that just means is that there are not very many buyers for the labor or for the factor. And generally, we have this word monopsony to describe imperfectly competitive markets. And we could have a monopsony market, actually, that's a product market, where you might have a defense contractor, for example, that they have one customer, and that's the US government. But in general, we don't talk about monopsonies in product markets. We talk about them in factor markets because they appear a lot more often. And in the sense, it's a market where there's very few, or even just one. A pure monopsony would just be one buyer. So labor markets, that would be the case where there's very few firms hiring workers. And you might imagine that, for example, if you're facing a scenario where there's only 3 or 4 companies that would hire you, that are even hiring your type of occupation within a geographic area, you're facing a monopsonistically competitive labor market. So the classic example is a coal mine town where the only employer in town is the coal mine. But others you could imagine where you might have a truck stop town where the only employer in town is a truck stop or a handful of fast food restaurants. Now, one thing we're going to find is that with these types of markets, the market for labor is equal to the firm. Because for them, the firm is the market. The entire supply of labor, therefore, would just flow to the firm. So they're going to have, therefore, they're going to have an upward sloping supply. So they face the market supply curve. And so what we have here in this table is actually a supply function. We have quantity of labor, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and a wage that increases. So as the wage rises, we find that the quantity of labor rises. And what we'll observe is that as a result of this idea, the upward sloping supply curve, that the marginal factor cost is going to be greater than the wage. So for these types of firms, the marginal factor cost does not equal the wage. So let's take a look at why. So these are total cost and marginal factor cost. These are the ideas as how much it costs in total to hire the number of workers, and then how much does it cost to hire a specific worker. So let's get started. If they hired one worker and they paid a wage of 1, well, then their total cost is 1. Now at the 0th worker, right, the 0th worker, their 0th cost was 0, so the additional cost here was just 1. If they hired 2 workers, in order to induce the second worker to get off the couch, right, because they have an upward sloping supply curve of labor, to get the second worker, they have to pay the higher wage. And so they pay that's $2. Now the problem is this monopsonist cannot wage discriminate, which means they have to pay the $2 to all their employees. So while the wage is 2, the total cost is 4, the marginal cost of hiring the second worker is 3. Now that may not seem immediately apparent, but it's the idea that you paid the second worker 2, and it cost an extra $1 beyond that, so the total cost of the worker was 3 because that extra $1 had to get paid to the first worker now. Now what if the firm hired 3 workers? Well, to get 3, they'd have to pay 3, so the total cost is 9. The marginal factor cost is 5. 16, 25, 7, and 9. So we can see here that for the first worker, the wage and the MFC are the same. For the second one and the third one and all of the ones that follow, the MFC column is going to be higher than, right, it's going to be way up here. MFC is going to look like that. It's going to be higher than the wage column because the wage is actually coming from that supply curve. The supply curve is telling us, hey, look over here, and it tells you the wage. So let's go ahead and graph what this might look like in practice as a result of this. So this type of a monopsonist, quantity, labor, wage, they're going to have a downward sloping demand for labor, and it's equal to the marginal revenue product. So that's just like normal, and that's MP times the price, the marginal product of the factor, of the worker in that case. And they're going to have an upward sloping supply of labor that tells the firm what the wage is. Okay? And then they're going to have this other line, an MFC. Now, firms are going to always hire where MRP equals MFC. They're always going to do that. So quantity at, and that's going to be here. That quantity defined, Q star. Now the problem is, what's the wage that they're going to pay? Now they're not going to pay this wage. Not going to pay up here, because this is just the MFC. The wage is actually coming from the supply curve, which is down here. So the wage at Q star is down here. Now if this looks a little familiar, it should, because, and this is a monopoly graph turned upside down. Marginal cost, which is equal to the supply curve, and we know that they produce where MR equals MC. They price up on the demand curve. So you can see there's some similarities here, and in fact all it is the same picture, but it's just reversed over the top, right? It's reversed along the x-axis. And in fact all of the curves are reversed as well. So like this curve, the marginal revenue, actually becomes the marginal factor cost. This curve, which is the demand, which tells us the price, becomes the supply curve, which tells us the wage. This curve, which was the demand for labor, becomes the supply over here. And we also observe that they are not at the optimal. Right? They're not at the optimal. So therefore, there's deadweight loss. So there's a number of workers who are not obtaining jobs here. So there's an optimal quantity and an optimal wage. Optimal wage. And what we'll find is that monopsonists underpay, in the sense, that should say W star, in the sense that W star is below the optimal wage, and they underemploy because the quantity that they actually employ is less than the optimal. Just like monopolies overcharge compared to the optimal price, and they underproduce compared to the optimal. So monopsonies are not efficient. They're a market failure. Now let's take a look at the implications of a minimum wage in this type of a market, because a price ceiling actually is often used to fix the monopoly. Let's take a look at what might happen with a price floor with a monopsony. So this is demand equals marginal revenue product, and then we're going to do supply and upward sloping MFC, and that should be a straight line, but I'm a little wonky on this pen. So then this is the quantity that they actually produce and they pay on the supply curve. So we'll say W star, Q star. Now if we put in a price floor right here as a minimum wage, that has the effect of changing the MFC. And so we'll say MFC 1. Because what it says is they can't pay below this value. So this monopsonist has to, every single time, whenever they hire someone, it costs them the same amount. So this becomes a new MFC. That old MFC disappears. So ignore that MFC, and now look for where is the quantity at MRP equals MFC. So the new MRP equals MFC. MFC MRP intercepts here at Q1, right, we'll say. So the quantity of workers who get jobs increases, and the minimum wage increases the wages that they're paid. So this is an example. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it's the idea that by forcing them to hire those additional workers, by setting a price floor, it actually forces them to hire those additional workers who wouldn't have gotten jobs otherwise. Now let's say that the policymaker gets a little carried away and raises that minimum wage even further. And they raise it up to what we'll call MFC 2 or W min 2. Now at this point, forget about that old MFC 1 and forget about that MFC. It's not there anymore. MFC 2 and MRP intercept right here at Q star. So we're right back to Q star again, but the workers are getting paid even more than they used to. Okay? So there's still deadweight loss at Q star, but this time the workers are getting paid much more. Now if you were a policymaker and you raised it even farther, you got really carried away, MFC 3, and we'll say min 3, the new intercept is way up here of MRP and MFC. And that would generate unemployment. Q3 is unemployment. So there is, this model predicts that at a certain level, minimum wages would create unemployment. But there is a range between W star and W min 2 for which actually it increases the number of people who get jobs and it increases the wages for them. So a counterintuitive idea, but one that's gaining a lot of interest in the economics world today. So anyways, hopefully this helped you understand and make sense a little bit of imperfectly competitive factor markets, and I'll see you next time.